Now, that's just my personal observation. I don't think the Russians have any interest in attacking Norway. I don't think the Russians want to isolate Norway. In fact, I don't think they care what Norway does. They would be happy to do business with Norway. But again, I am seeing Russia through a lens that's very different from what we in London and Washington are pushing. We're pushing this false paradigm. The revanchist Soviet leader is leading the new resurrected Soviet Union on a bid to conquer Eastern Europe. See no evidence for it. Nothing could be further from the truth. But if you're sitting in Oslo and you believe that, then it may make sense to you to offer these bases. But I would urge Norwegians to give this careful consideration. There is no substitute for good relations with your neighbor. And it is advisable to cultivate good relations if you can. I don't see any benefit to bad relations, and I don't think they're necessary. But I hold a minority opinion, obviously.
Well, I'd say a couple of things. First of all, that the Russian progress turned out to be different from what I anticipated. I thought that they would go in on 3 or 4 operational axes and cut deeply into Ukraine. Instead, and of course, I did not have a copy of the operations order, so I didn't know what the instructions to Russian commanders were. But the Russian commanders were instructed to minimize casualties on the Ukrainian side. Mm-hmm. In other words, they knew they were going into eastern Ukraine, where most of the population is effectively Russian, but they also didn't want to do any unnecessary collateral damage. They wanted to avoid unnecessary collateral damage as much as possible. So instead, they advanced on a front of almost 500 kilometers in these battalion tactical groups, which is an interesting and a good organization for combat. I think it's proven itself in many ways. But this spread them very thinly. And I think the underlying assumption was that many of the Russians there would rapidly come over to them, which would ease their progress through Ukraine. But then the Russians themselves discovered, these are the Russian commanders, that they had made a terrible mistake in Moscow in one area. They had told the Russians in eastern Ukraine, well, we're coming in. We're going to destroy Ukrainian forces, effectively denazified, as I think your listeners have heard. And then we're going to leave. And we're not going to stay permanently. We're simply interested in the autonomy or independence of the 2 breakaway republics in the east and legitimizing Crimea. Well, the Russian population said, that's fine, then don't expect any help from us, because if you're not going to stay here permanently and liberate us from the Ukrainians, then when you leave, the Ukrainian secret police will roll in and kill all of us and our families. Well, that had a big impact in Moscow. People finally began recognizing that this was about much more than just destroying the Ukrainian army. That was essential. And that has taken time, largely because the Ukrainians decided to move into cities and urban areas and to prepare defenses and to sit down and wait for the Russians to arrive. The Ukrainians have never launched an operational counteroffensive. There have been minor counterattacks here or there on a battalion level, but nothing organized across the front. So the Russians then changed their modus operandi. And they recognized that if these Ukrainian forces were going to immobilize them in defensive positions in cities or elsewhere, well, that's when you bring in your strike forces, your artillery, rocket artillery, conventional artillery, tactical ballistic missiles, and you pulverize them out of existence. That's what they've done. And the Ukrainians have not managed to organize any serious counterattack. They talked about a 1 million-man counteroffensive recently, which of course never materialized. And no one knows what the exact casualty figures are, but I can tell you the ones that are being floated in the West